Welcome to Molecules to Mindset, the podcast where science meets everyday life. I'm your host, Iwama, and together we'll explore the fascinating ways science and healthcare touch every part of our lives. From the molecules that make up our bodies to the thoughts and attitudes that shape our experiences, we're here to dive into it all. Every episode will tackle topics that matter to you, breaking down complex scientific concepts into something that you can relate to and use. We'll chat with experts, share real life stories, and discover how health and science are not just topics for researchers and doctors, but are integral parts of our daily lives. Whether you're looking to understand more about your own health, interested in the latest scientific discoveries, or just curious about how the world works, Molecules to Mindset has something for you. So today I'm so honored to have Mrs. Iwama on our podcast. Mrs. Iwama's journey in healthcare began in 1974 upon graduating from nursing school in St. John's, Newfoundland. From her early days in emergency at Grace General Hospital to her specialized roles in intensive and coronary care across Canada, Mrs. Iwama has amassed a wealth of experience and expertise. After her time at Grace General Hospital, Mrs. Iwama ventured to the Janeway Children's Hospital in 1976, where she focused on intensive care and neonatal care. Subsequently, she brought her skills to emergency at the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster in 1978, followed by intensive care and coronary care positions at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver from 1980 to 1982. Continuing her journey, Mrs. Iwama worked in intensive and coronary care at the Ottawa General Hospital in 1982 and 1983. Her dedication to nursing education led to her role as a clinical instructor at Vancouver Community College in 1983, all the way until 1985. Beyond her clinical and educational endeavors, Mrs. Iwama has also played a pivotal role in supporting others through grief, facilitating a grief support group at Surrey Memorial Hospital for about 5 years. With over 20 years of experience as a palliative care volunteer, Mrs. Iwama brings a wealth of insights into our conversation today. Welcome, Mrs. Iwama. It's a pleasure to have you joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here with you, Ivani.
Thank you so much. So I guess with that introduction, we'll just jump into the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So first, I just wanted to ask, can you share a little bit about the journey that led you to pursue a career in nursing, and what were some of the key inspirations or moments that influenced your decision to pursue nursing?
Actually, it wasn't until about grade 11 that I decided to be a nurse.
Okay.
And, the whys when you're at that age aren't always obvious. But, looking back, I've wondered if it was influenced by my own sort of um, horrific experience, really, as a child when I was 10 with a traumatic operating room experience
Mm.
and a hospitalization for a month.
Wow.
And so I wondered if that sort of really difficult time for me, even as a kid, just somehow inspired me to just
Hmm.
be with others, who were going through a challenging time.
So you feel like that event was kind of maybe your seed into healthcare that maybe grew.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, I think so.
And over the course of your career, for all the years that you practice, what were some of the most significant experiences that you had during that time?
I think probably starting with the Janeway. And
Okay.
because before that, I had worked in like an adult emerge, and then moving to the Janeway was such a learning curve because it was, looking after children. That's quite different.
Mhm.
And but the Janeway was just an amazing place to work. We were kind of the tertiary care center for the island of Newfoundland, with the only really big pediatric center. And two of the things that I loved about that job
Mhm.
was that we were part, like the nurses took, we were on like a rotation of with air ambulance.
Okay.
And so you can imagine, you're in your 20s, you're part of an air ambulance team, like who will fly out to a different part of Newfoundland to
Wow.
pick up like a really sick baby,
Wow.
like like a preemie
Mm-hmm.
or a really sick child. And you go there with, a doctor from intensive care, like a respiratory tech,
Mm-hmm.
but you were part of this big adventure.
Right, right.
And there was just something wonderful about that experience
Mm-hmm.
of being able, yeah, to just go and be a part of that. And so I love that part of that job.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of that job that I really loved was we did a lot of open heart surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were the nurse who was going to look after that child post op, then the day before you got to go meet that child,
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of build a bit of a relationship if they were old enough,
Right.
um, and meet with the family, reassure them that you were going to be the one looking after their little son or daughter, and we also basically then had the privilege of actually going into the OR and seeing the surgery being done.
Wow.
So like it was just like this all inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, just like so rewarding
Right.
to be a part of that, and then to be a part of that child's recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the highlight of that was the highlight there. And then when I moved out here to emerge at the
Mm-hmm.
Columbian, um, that was more. I mean, even at the Janeway, some of the challenges were that, I mean, children did die,
Mm-hmm.
and so being young, that was kind of a very challenging thing to process, really. Um, but at the Columbian, I think there was more, you know, I don't know, more of death.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, it's amazing how after so many years,
Mm-hmm.
you can remember vividly
Yeah.
some events,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're just so impactful.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was um, this mom who brought in her little baby that was about 7 months old,
Mm-hmm.
and the baby was unconscious. And I guess that evening, the baby had been crying and crying and crying. And the boyfriend that was with her couldn't stand the crying anymore.
Oh
So he
no.
took the baby and he put the baby in a dresser drawer
Mm.
and started just moving the drawer back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, when the baby came in, we worked on that baby for so long, that baby died,
Oh gosh.
right? And so that was very traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lady that worked in the hospital, and her 16-year-old daughter took an overdose, died. We worked on her for 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we had a supervisor that, was going home that night, came in, checked on everybody, make sure the staffing was good. She left. We all said goodbye. Half an hour later, the ambulance is coming in. She's dead on arrival.
Oh my gosh.
She left, went over the Petula Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
An impaired driver was coming, hit her car. That was it.
My God.
So like those things just kind of they stay with you, right?
Mhm. Yeah, understand.
And
Yeah.
right. And back in those days, there was no like debriefing. Like, thank
Mhm.
goodness now, things have
Yeah.
improved.
Mhm.
So like there's debriefing for the staff who, experience these, kinds of traumas, right?
Yeah, because
So
I was gonna ask, like, how did you deal with those traumatic experiences? I can't imagine that that must have been easy. And I know that sometimes people say, you can become desensitized to certain situations, but I mean, there are certain situations that definitely are going to stick with you. And how do you cope with that? How do you deal with the stress and the sadness of that?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, back then we just kind of moved on because it's not like now where you're given some time to go. We,
Mm-hmm.
I think, we just talked with each other,
Right.
maybe over coffee or when we went for lunch, thinking like that was like, just how terrible that was and like how we felt. It's not like we could, take the day off,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, when that young person died, you dealt with the family when they came
Yeah.
and all of that. And when they left, you just moved on to the next patient.
Mm-hmm. Like you didn't have much time to process what you had just gone through.
No,
Very busy.
no,
Right.
no.
So
But
do
often
you,
when you left work, you did, like you went home. Sometimes you couldn't sleep
mm-hmm.
because you're kind of replaying this in
Mm-hmm.
your mind, right? And just feeling the impact of that in your own soul, really.
Right. Yeah. Because I
Yeah,
was gonna say, is that one of the things that you had wish you had back then when you were a nurse, like more, support groups and things like that that were available that maybe were not available back in your career days? Um,
absolutely.
mhm,
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's, in a way, you're traumatized by these events, right?
mhm,
So you carry that. And like I said, I think for many of us, we talked about it just, among ourselves. There was no quote professional,
right.
help.
Mhm,
Um, but somehow we talked, we and just moved on. But it was sort of the thing to do.
right. Do you think that, like reflecting on your career in nursing, do you think that, um, that like learning to move on was one of the most important lessons you learned, or what was one of the most important lessons you learned? It seemed like you had to be quite adaptable, like dealing with a certain traumatic situation, then going to the next and being
Hmm.
okay and, introducing yourself to the next family and being there for the
Yes.
child, making a connection. So what were some
Yeah.
of the most important lessons that you learned and how did they like shape your patient care interactions?
Well, I feel in those situations, again, there was just a certain amount of like this separation that you had to make in
Hmm.
order to function, because that next patient, that next family, they deserved your very best,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Even though you inside was still feeling, a lot left over from that last event.
Right, right.
So, but you had to be very conscious,
Hmm.
almost like step back, take a breath, and here I am fully present to
Hmm.
you now.
Right. Yeah, you say I guess had to like take a minute to collect yourself and then move on to the next
Yeah,
patient, right?
and move on. And so I think later it became more evident that it was, very important to honor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Honor your own emotions. But
Mm-hmm.
again, I think when you are in these situations, um, it's very difficult to give yourself permission to linger there longer
Mm-hmm.
because of the just the type of place where you're working. There is no time. It's not like the
Mm-hmm.
three people that were involved in that, they can go home now and you can call in three more people.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you gather yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
You
So
center yourself
mm-hmm.
and become aware of what now
Mm-hmm. And what to focus on next, right?
and
Right.
what to focus on next.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I understand. So do you think that like that was one of the biggest challenges that you dealt with in your career as a nurse? Like, having to move on very quickly and maybe not getting enough time to process some of these events, or maybe it was something else?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the sort of long term, I think that was the most had the most negative impact
Mm-hmm.
was that. Because you still, and there's an amount of like detachment
Mm-hmm.
that is necessary in order to go on,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not always healthy in life,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
and you look back and you think, wow, um, even when I became a mom,
Mm-hmm.
when something was wrong with my children, like I always minimized it
Mm-hmm.
because it was all seen through the eyes of like these big deals,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
We're not going to get carried away about that
Mm-hmm.
because obviously inside I had seen that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it impacts you in different ways of how you even see yourself when you're sick, your family,
Mm-hmm.
right? It has long-term effects in that way.
Yeah, like I see what you're saying. You kind of had to dissociate your own personal thoughts and feelings to deal with this current situation that you had at hand,
Mm-hmm.
tackle that.
Yeah.
Right. I see what you're saying. So besides, um, I was also going to ask, when you said you had to learn how to, detach your thoughts and feelings, was that something that was challenging to do initially? Because I can't imagine that being easy, just turning off like how you feel about certain situations.
No, it's not easy. That's
Mm-hmm.
a very, yeah, you have to make like a conscious decision
Mm-hmm.
with the idea. Um, I mean, if you had the opportunity, it was the end of your shift and you could go for a walk in the park and you could think about that and process it or cry if you needed to, but in this situation, you had to detach from it because that was not going to be helpful now if you didn't.
Mm-hmm.
To that next person who are in that next bed who's probably significantly sick as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you still need to bring some sort of your heart to that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. Each patient deserves your
Yes, your
care.
best,
Right. Right.
right?
That makes sense. Aside from like those challenges that you experienced, what were some of the experiences that you had where that were very like positive and that you really enjoyed? Like I know you mentioned you really liked forming the connections with the children and helping them after.
Mm-hmm.
But what were some of the other like positive experiences that you had as a nurse?
Well, I think generally when you see people come, whether that's an emerge or an intensive care, and you see the process of them getting well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very gratifying,
Right.
right? And I remember one particular night in St. Paul's, and we had this patient who had open heart surgery that day, and according to the monitor and everything that was going on, we thought something significant is going down here.
Mm-hmm.
So we called the surgeon, and he came in. It was obviously this person was having a massive bleed inside. And so it was like something out of a movie
Mm-hmm.
that he took, the instrument that you need to unstaple all the staples that the patient had going up their chest.
Mm-hmm.
He unstapled them all in a second.
Wow.
Next thing you know, he has the patient's heart in his hand.
Oh my gosh.
He's doing these very like compressions with the heart. And it
Gosh.
was like, we're just like, my gosh, like, is this for real? And that patient survived,
Wow.
right? Like
That's crazy.
that, I know that like stands out forever,
Oh my
right?
gosh. That I
Yeah.
don't even know how he got the heart out so fast. That's
Well, I'm telling you, it was all happening in the twinkling of an eye. It
wow.
was like a wow. That was a wow, right?
Yeah.
And looking back on, cardiac arrests that, happen in Emerge and, part of Emerge and ICU, like you're part of a cardiac arrest team.
Mm.
So like to go and see somebody in arrest and be able to revive them and someday see them go home.
Right.
Like, I mean, that's wow,
Right. Like
right?
seeing the full experience from the bad to the good and being there for every
Abs-
step of the way.
yeah. And so, and just sort of the camaraderie and,
Mhm.
of, just working with people and
Mhm.
you're never just like on your own, like you're a team, right?
Right.
So the joy of that, of being part of a team and seeing these things come together,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And like I said, people with many challenges,
Mhm.
um, yeah, being able to, you know, leave the hospital and live
Right.
good lives,
Mhm.
right?
And I think that it's so nice that they were able to have such a caring, compassionate nurse like yourself too, because, for especially for children and for others as well, but when they're at the hospital, they're very like, oftentimes very weak and vulnerable. And I'm sure
Mhm.
that they really appreciate having a nurse that takes the time to connect with them. Because I'm sure like waking up after like a surgery or something like that must be quite alarming.
Mhm.
And then seeing a familiar face would be quite comforting.
Mhm.
So I think
Yeah.
it's really great. And I think that it's nice that you also emphasize the importance of those connections.
Mhm. Yeah.
I was gonna ask too, just like in general, if anyone's watching and they're interested in pursuing a career in nursing, what did like an average day to day look like for you?
Well, I guess if you're in Emerge, say, it would be very unpredictable,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's one of the things I really liked about Emerge is that I tend not to like sameness. So,
Mhm. It's
and I
always
also like
changing.
a bit of excitement.
Right,
So,
right.
variety.
Mm-hmm.
So, and like you got to be, pretty sharp on your toes, quick thinking, quick decision making. If you like that kind of thing, ER is the place to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, in ICU, a day would look different depending on sort of like the kind of patient that you
Mm-hmm.
have for that day, right? You have somebody who's had open heart surgery, your day would look like maybe they're trying to come off the ventilator if they're on it. Um, so that would be the focus, getting them out of bed, like that kind of stuff. Um, but you could also be in ICU and you're looking after somebody who's had a really bad head injury
Mm-hmm.
and they're in an induced coma. So then they're on a ventilator. And
Mm-hmm.
so all the things that go on, with that experience, right? So it's, and in ICU, um, the good thing about in an ICU environment, patients are obviously there because they're very ill.
Mm-hmm.
And, but generally, patients who are on event, you only have one patient.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Okay, so you're assigned to
Yeah,
single, so that's really
just
different from
one.
emergency medicine where you're dealing with a lot. Wow.
Yeah, a lot, right? Or even
Mhm.
out on the ward, like nurses have
Mm.
6, 7, more, whatever. In ICU, depending on how sick they are,
Mhm.
and if, like I said, if they are ventilated, then
Mhm.
that you will just generally, although when I worked in Ottawa, that sometimes wasn't always the case, but at the Royal Columbian in St. Paul's,
Mhm.
a person on a ventilator, they were your only
Wow.
patient. So you can imagine the focus that
Mhm.
you're able to have, but also needed because they're usually like multi-system failure kind of
Mhm.
patients, right? Lots going on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you feel like when you worked in the ICU, I mean, obviously depending on the patient's condition, but do you feel like you're able to form a better connection with those patients since you're the only nurse compared to emergency medicine where it's kind of like more fast paced and you're dealing with a lot of patients and a huge variety?
Well, like ventilated patients is difficult because they're
Yeah,
not
exactly.
talking.
Exactly, yeah.
So what you build relationship with is the family
Mm-hmm.
and your support to them.
I see.
And also, depending on how long that patient is in, and you've done 4 days, 4 12-hour days,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're on a ventilator, they can be awake at times. So they get to know you. Um, you can tell they're comfortable with you. They might even open their eyes in a way like they're happy to see you, a familiar face.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, so in those environments, it's often um, the families that you end up spending talking time with, right?
Right.
But obviously, we know that sometimes you can have deep connections with people without a lot of words,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just your
right?
presence and being
Your
there.
presence, how you care for them,
Mhm.
speaking to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure even you just having like a casual, even if they can't respond, but a casual conversation with them
Yeah.
about the day, and I'm sure that they would really appreciate that.
Yeah. Tell them what day it is,
Yeah, exactly.
the weather, what it's like
Yeah,
outside, and
exactly.
yeah, all of that.
That's
Yeah.
great. I think that your experiences as a nurse are so interesting, and I hope that the viewers watching this also
Mm-hmm.
appreciate them. I also wanted to get into some other
Mm-hmm.
as well, particularly to do with the situation in British Columbia. So, just to give a background for the viewers, right now in British Columbia, there's a current nursing shortage, and there's a demand for healthcare service that's really growing in BC. And the shortage of nurses has put an immense pressure on the healthcare facilities and on family physicians. And this shortage not only affects patient care, but it also increases the workload for our healthcare professionals. And it's a situation that has left many patients facing longer wait times and limited access to the care that they need. To address this challenge, nurse practitioners, also known as NPs, have been expanding their scope of practice, stepping in, providing more support, and these highly skilled professionals are taking on more responsibilities from diagnosing and managing illnesses to prescribing medications. Their role is becoming increasingly vital in ensuring that patients receive timely and effective care. So, I wanted to ask you, Mrs. Iwama, do you think that the expanded practice of nurse practitioners is helping alleviate the burdens on family physicians? And if so, do you expect more nurse practitioner clinics in the community in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yes to both.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I think it's definitely lightening the load.
Mhm,
Um, I know of friends whose, family doctor retired
mhm.
and their new primary caregiver is a nurse practitioner.
Hey.
And, they're enjoying um, sort of this new experience. And of course, it's a bit of a shift for people in their thinking,
Mhm.
right? Who have never known anything but
Right.
a family doctor.
Exactly.
So like there's gotta have to be like a bit of movement for people in terms of like their expectations, right?
Mhm,
But I've noticed for my friends who have nurse practitioners
mhm.
as their primary caregiver, they're happy. They
That's
feel it's working, and even here, like close to where we live,
mhm.
there is a clinic. I think there's maybe at least 3 or 4 in one clinic, and they're all nurse practitioners.
Wow. That's great.
So I think that's a very positive step.
Mhm,
And so hopefully, I guess is what we hope for is that there will be more capacity
mhm,
for more nurse practitioners,
mhm.
um, who will, like I said, take on some of these patients who are just floating around um, with no particular, primary caregiver, right?
Yeah, exactly, because that's quite alarming. I know that I think in Ontario, some of the wait times can be up to 3 months to see family physicians. So if the nurse
Mm-hmm.
practitioners are able to help out and yeah, alleviate that burden, I think that that's great. But I
Yeah.
also wanted to touch on another point that is really interesting that you brought up. Do you feel that sometimes you were saying that patients' expectations sometimes are a little different? So like
Mm-hmm.
you mean like sometimes there's a certain like stigmatization around nurse practitioners and that matter?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But
I,
it's a new thing,
mhm.
right? And
Or
if,
maybe they're
you know,
unfamiliar.
yeah, it's a new thing, a new concept. And I think, when we're used to things a certain way our whole lives, and then suddenly you're going to see a nurse, right?
Right.
Even though she's a nurse practitioner,
Mhm.
there's a little bit of a hurdle
Right.
for people. And I think again, it's a matter of time, education,
Mhm.
people hearing other people maybe say, hey, like, I've got this fabulous nurse
Mhm.
practitioner, I think she's great. She spends, lots of time with me. I think, over time, it will become, more accepted and
Mhm.
less of a hurdle.
Yeah, like it definitely you're saying like there's some like a period needed for that adjustment to
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
right. And that's great. I mean, if these nurse practitioners are able to provide the care that family physicians can't because they're so overburdened with patients,
Mm-hmm.
it's great. I wanted to also ask you, since you were a critical care nurse for 11 years, before becoming a palliative care volunteer, I wanted to ask you what motivated you to make that significant career change?
Well, after becoming a mom and staying home for a few years, I started to realize like I really missed um, sort of being part of a medical community,
Hmm.
and I also missed just that part of being someone who I guess had been used to being in spaces where you felt you were able, in some capacity or another,
Hmm.
to alleviate suffering,
Hmm. Hmm.
and having sort of um, been present to many people who had died,
Hmm.
with many families who were with them. Um, I just felt like bringing that experience into palliative care um, would be really helpful.
Hmm. Right.
And I realized that after I sort of started volunteering, that it was because
Hmm.
it wasn't sort of like a new experience,
Hmm.
just it was familiar.
Right.
And I think probably able to enter into it
Hmm.
in a way that maybe other volunteers had maybe a more difficult time to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, because of your experience that, you had to, you said you spent a lot of time with the families in the ICU.
Mm-hmm.
You got to kind of use those experiences to help you in as a palliative care volunteer because
Mm-hmm.
you're spending a lot of time with family members who are with their loved ones in palliative care, and
Mm-hmm.
you got to establish those connections with the patients just as you did working with the neonatal care
Mm-hmm.
and with the children. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that is really interesting that that kind of led you to
Mm-hmm.
volunteering. And I also wanted to ask, so in palliative care, navigating ethical dilemmas is an inherent aspect of it. And where decisions about pain management, treatment options, and end of life care often intersect with the complex moral, cultural, and spiritual considerations. So, as a palliative care volunteer, could you share some of the ethical challenges that you maybe observed, or how you kind of approach these situations as a volunteer to help patients process the decisions that they made?
I think one of the challenges as a volunteer was sort of you spend all this time, sitting with people. Often they tell you things that maybe they're not yet telling their family.
Oh,
And,
okay.
right? Not sure if they want to talk about that yet. So that in the meantime, then there becomes this dilemma,
Mhm.
right? Of sort of being an advocate.
Mhm.
Should I be an advocate? Um, but also realizing that there's a certain amount of neutrality that you
Mhm.
have to have in conversations,
Mhm.
with the family. And of course, you could only share information that the patient would have given you permission to do so,
Right.
right?
Right.
And often that permission isn't given because they themselves are withholding that information,
Mhm.
right? So then you wouldn't obviously be the one to go and tell the family what was just told to you
Right.
in confidence.
Mhm.
So even though you know that you imagine that that would be for the greater good of them
Mhm.
and for their family,
Mhm.
but you kind of have to stay um, neutral about it
I see.
until such a time.
I see. It's kind of like a tug and pull where,
Yes.
you want to tell them everything, but at the end of the day, you have to respect the patient's wishes. And if they choose to withhold that information,
Hmm.
you have to respect that. That could be quite difficult navigating because I can
Hmm.
you would want the best for your patient, but I guess it's not for you to decide. It's for the
No, it's
patient.
not. And also, just sort of the dilemma of not imposing, your own convictions,
Hmm. Yeah,
right?
having to withhold
On
what you
other
think.
people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because um I know you helped create the My Voice document, right, for the phrase
Hmm.
advanced care planning. And that document ensured that individuals can make informed decisions for their end of life care ahead of time. So
Hmm.
um, I guess that document really helped families, prevent having to scramble at the end of their loved one's life. Um, and do you think that maybe creating that My Voice document, you were able to kind of circumvent some of those challenges you just described,
Hmm.
by having to, withhold certain information?
Hmm. Yes. I think this document was kind of forged out of frustration, probably mostly with paramedics and
Okay.
emerge
Mhm.
and probably eventually families
Right.
because if you go to a home with a 911 call and there's this person who looks like they need extra support with their breathing and you go and intubate these people and bring them into emerge and put them on a ventilator only to find out that when the family member shows up
Mhm.
that a couple of months ago grandma or grandpa or whoever had a conversation at the family dinner about what they would not want to be.
Mhm.
One of them was they would not want to be resuscitated,
Oh.
but nobody knew. The
Mhm.
person who came, or there was no evidence anywhere. Who would have known that?
Yeah.
Nobody would have known that, right?
Mhm.
And so I think so many of those situations happened.
Mhm.
Um, and also then, people coming into emerge or even, making the decision of, would this person want to be going to ICU? Would
Mhm.
they want all heroic measures?
Mhm.
People are, some family members, I don't know. Someone else would say, oh, I think mom would want that. The other would say, oh, I don't think mom, like,
Mhm.
so this document was so pivotal in removing all of that,
Right. Yeah.
right? So that way the person can actually, the document is quite detailed,
Mhm.
where you have an opportunity to write out. It gets you to think about what are my beliefs, my values, my wishes, even like writing down what makes life meaningful for me, right? Um, and then, in that they have to fill out, what do I need to learn about my health?
Mhm.
And there's questions about that. And then in it, you also have an area where you can, should say a time come, how about if you have a stroke
Mm.
and you can't make a decision?
Yeah. Mhm.
Then there's a place that you can write in a
Mhm.
substitute decision maker,
Okay. I see.
right? And then after you've done all your workbook, then you have this conversation with your family.
Mhm.
Sometimes the family helps with all the planning.
Mhm.
And then you record it all. And some people fill it all in the booklet. Um, some people can do an audio recording, a video. But the most important part in it, there's this green envelope with a magnet on the back that
Mhm.
sticks on the fridge
Mhm.
of your house.
Mhm.
So then when the paramedics arrive,
I see.
they look at the fridge
Right.
and they can take out that document,
Mhm.
and in it, it says exactly what you want and do not want.
Mhm. Yeah, that's I see. I mean, that's a great way to navigate the conflict that has to happen between, I mean, I can imagine like a lot of conflict happens between family members, when like you're saying, when one's saying mom wants this versus the other saying no, mom would want that. That could be
Mm-hmm.
quite difficult to navigate. And I feel like this document just totally circumvents that. And it
Yeah.
also too, because I feel like it maintains patient autonomy too when they're unable to speak for themselves, it's written down and this is what
Mm-hmm.
they wanted for themselves. So I think that that's really important to have. And it's really important to have those conversations, like you're saying. Yes, they're tough conversations, but they need to be done because if something happens that was against that patient's wish, um, that would be not great. That would be really bad. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's an essential tool that you help facilitate. That's great.
Yeah. And even if people, and I think, in life, we think that only old people die.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
So I think everybody needs to have a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
young or old,
Right. Yeah.
about, even if you don't do, an extensive document,
Mm-hmm.
even have a conversation about what you would want and not want.
Right.
It's very important.
Mm-hmm. For sure. It definitely is. And yeah, life is unexpected, so
It
these
is.
conversations are always necessary to have.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of life being unexpected, I have another
Yeah.
question. So for the viewers who don't know, um, in British Columbia right now, there's a legal medical procedure called medical assistance in dying, also known as MAiD, and that
Mm-hmm.
basically allows eligible individuals suffering from um, uh, medical conditions that are not really treatable to request and receive assistance in dying. And this law was enacted to provide patients with a compassionate choice to end their suffering and maintain control over their final days. So I just want to ask you, from your experience as a palliative care volunteer, you've seen those firsthand challenges being with those patients at the end of their life. And I just wanted to know like how you feel about the implementation of MAiD in BC and or like what the impact that you think it has on patients and families that you volunteer with.
I think the implementation of MAiD, um, has given, as you have just said, has given people an option,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have noticed that giving people an option seems to um, remove sort of this worry and concern about what their end of life will look like,
I see. Okay.
right? And somehow, when they've made that decision,
Mhm.
I have noticed like it's the worry and concern seems to be replaced with peace,
Mm. Interesting.
because um, some people are concerned about, yes, what will those end days look like?
Right.
What will I be in a lot of pain? Will I be able to talk? Will I, you know, how much weight and more am I going to lose?
Mhm.
And believe it or not, some people feel the burden, especially if their illness has been a long illness. Some people feel like the burden that they feel their family have been carrying
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
months on end, right?
Mhm. They
And
take
they
it.
see how tired the
Mhm.
family is,
Yeah.
right? And and there's some who just say like, I want them to
Mhm.
just be able to move on with their lives.
Right. Mhm.
I don't want this dragged out for another 2 months or whatever, right?
Mhm.
So it's, often it's about them, but often people are still thinking about others,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And what it's costing others, emotionally, physically. Um, and, there are people who make that decision and their disease progresses so quickly, MAiD hasn't needed to happen.
Mhm. Yeah. Mhm.
But I think there seems to be a sense of relief
Mhm.
for those who are actually entertaining. I mean, there's a lot of people who are not,
Yeah.
implementing MAiD.
Mhm.
But for those who have thought about that, have the desire for it,
Mhm.
it's sort of like they like they breathe a sigh of relief
Mhm.
having the option
Yeah.
there.
And maybe they
And
a sense of control also over their final,
absolutely.
preserving that
Yeah.
autonomy.
And yeah, I agree. And, for some families, they're completely supportive of
Mhm.
this with their loved one.
Mhm.
Some families are not. And some at times it's divisive,
Mhm.
where some people in the family agree that, mom or dad or grandma or grandpa has made that decision, and some people are not. So, it's not just, you know, 100% everybody in agreement.
Right.
Sometimes it is. And that's sort of the best that you could hope for,
Mhm.
right?
Right. It's a complicated issue. There's no, yeah, like you're saying, black or white answer. It depends on each
No.
their case, what their family believes.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that that's really interesting that you bring up the burden that it also has on its family, on the families as well. It's not
Hmm.
one person. And yeah, it definitely like it takes a toll on the families having to watch their loved ones go through something so painful or seeing them in a
Hmm.
state for so long. Um, I could see how that'd be really challenging. And I also feel for the families that, also, have trouble with this decision of going through MAiD,
Hmm.
because they might have difficulty dealing with the prospect of, yes, I know that my family member, is sick right now, but it might be a whole nother transition for them to actually deal with the death of a family member too, which could
Hmm.
be quite challenging. Yeah. Um, I also wanted to also ask you, and a kind of related question. You also facilitated the grief support group at Surrey Memorial
Hmm.
for the past 5 years. So you provided essential support for individuals that were navigating grief. So
Hmm.
could you maybe share what motivated you to start this group and what you learned through the grieving process and through your years of facilitating it? And what impact do you think that these sessions have on the participants that you volunteer with?
Again, I was invited to join this group to facilitate it. I had a friend who was sort of the head over spiritual care at Surrey, and so she was facilitating this group with another person, and the group was fairly large, so they needed another facilitator. And so again, this was birthed out of need, obviously. So if you work in the hospital, you've got palliative care, you've got a hospice facility where there's 20 people, 10 in palliative, and also people who, pass away who are actually on the wards. But when you think about the number of people who are experiencing loss, and where do they go with this grief? Because often, not always, but often the people who are grieving are older, right? And they have children who are very supportive, but also children have jobs. They have children, they have full lives. So at the end of the day, it's still you alone with your grief. So this group, for many people, they would say it was like save them, right? It helped them immensely, some said. Others said, I can't imagine how I would have survived without this group.
Wow.
Because in the group, the benefit of group work with grief is that everybody's journey of grieving looks different. And that's impacted by, the kind of relationship you had with the person who's no longer in your life. It's impacted by the circumstances around the death. If it was long-term, sudden, suicide, all these factors impact how a person grieves, right? But there's so many factors in it that you have in common in how it impacts your life, right? And so coming to a group, people get to share how they're feeling, and immediately someone else in the group realizes, I'm not alone. Other people are not sleeping. Other people don't want to eat anymore. They don't want to make meals for themselves.
They can relate to them, yeah.
They can relate. They don't want to go to that person's house now that they always went as a couple. And now I'm showing up by myself. So suddenly, it's like somebody else knows me,
right,
and what I'm experiencing. The other part of the grief group is that people are in the group who are early in their grief. Ours was a drop-in group, so you could keep coming up to a year. So the benefit of that was somebody is there who it's almost a year for them. And they're sitting at a table with somebody and it's been 2 months. And they can say to them, I so relate where you are. But like the support of this group and the friendships have been the thing that has kept me going. And here I am today, sort of able to laugh again, invest in relationships. I feel I've been starting to enjoy life a lot more than I did a year ago. So give people like this hope.
And I can
get stuck here.
Right,
right?
exactly. Like I can see how, that would be getting that validation from others and seeing that, they're
Mhm,
going through something similar to you can almost be kind of cathartic just to know that, you're not going through that alone. Um,
mhm,
yeah, I think that that's really nice. And when you touched on like a lot of the group members who attend these sessions are older adults, I think that it's great that, they're able to verbalize all of their feelings because, when you enter old age, it's not only your spouse that you might be losing, it's the friends around you, everyone else is
mhm,
getting older. So you're dealing with a lot. And there's
mhm,
also significant transitions that you experience when you come into that age. Like I think retirement can even be kind
mhm,
of a really big adjustment
mhm,
for others and almost like a sad loss, like almost
mhm,
yeah too, because it's such a change that you're used to something. So
mhm,
I think that that's great that it gives them an opportunity to speak about everything that they're feeling and
mhm.
help from others and get that
Yeah,
validation they need.
yeah,
Yeah.
and encouragement, you
Hmm.
know, encouragement from other people. And, people give out their phone numbers, they meet for coffee,
Great.
go for walks in the park. I mean, it's just a beautiful,
Mm.
it's a beautiful support in
Yeah.
such a challenging um, kind of piece of life, right?
And I'm sure that, your experiences where you kind of had to, go to the next patient and like you said yourself, you had to detach as a nurse and you said you didn't really feel like you had that opportunity to grieve. Maybe that influenced you to also want to join this group and provide
Hmm.
that support for people who are grieving.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it was very rewarding
Hmm.
to see people, come in and with such sadness and heavy burden, sort of, they were carrying, and to see over periods of weeks and months, to see healing and um, yeah, like new life springing forth in them.
Right.
Uh,
Exactly.
uh, it was actually a very beautiful experience to be a part of.
Right. I can imagine. Yeah. That must be very like satisfying to see.
Yes, very satisfying.
Right.
Yeah.
Just for our last question for today, I wanted to ask about cultural sensitivity in palliative care. So as a volunteer, I can assume that, you observed many interactions that highlighting the importance of communication, treatment, and decision making. Um, so each of those encounters that you have um, offers valuable insights into the diverse cultural landscapes that shape the end of life care of patients.
Mhm.
And that emphasizes the need for continuous learning and adaptation to ensure that patient care is very inclusive. So from your observations and experiences as a volunteer, how do you see cultural sensitivity impacting palliative care practices, and could you maybe share any specific instances or insights that highlight the importance of respecting diverse cultural backgrounds in providing end of life care?
Um, I think one of the things that many cultures value, and that is eating
Mhm.
and, making good food for
Mhm.
your family,
Right.
right? So, in palliative care, when people are in the end stage of life, families, there's nothing much left they can do,
Mhm.
right? To bring comfort.
Mhm.
They're there, they're present. That's obviously very comforting. But all their life, they've known this thing about making food,
Mhm.
right? Making good food
Mhm.
to help people feel better.
Yeah.
Right? And there's many cultures that have strong feelings about that.
Mhm.
So I think in palliative care, that was a bit of a challenge for people coming in and feeding patients, their loved one, even though that was not a safe thing to do,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Because the swallowing reflex is not there, it's high chance of choking, that kind of thing. So, there was obviously there was education needed in those moments,
Mhm.
right? And so out of that came, the development of like a little pamphlet. So now when families come, they can, read that and understand and know why
Mhm.
that's not a safe thing to do at certain stages, right? Um, but again, sensitivity to that, um, for the patient and for families. And um, I think in terms of other beliefs, I feel like palliative care in particular and hospice,
Mhm.
um, I think there's a great awareness and sensitivity and respect for people's um, like traditions, religious traditions, rituals.
Mhm.
And from my experience, I have seen a variety of things being honored
Mhm.
in terms of whether that's, some religions, faiths where, they want the body of their loved one to stay for X number of hours
Mhm.
in the room,
Mhm.
because of their beliefs about, when the soul leaves the body,
Mhm.
like many things.
Mhm.
Those things are always granted.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, there's singing, there is chanting, there are prayers, there are visits from different religious leaders bringing spiritual care.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, like it's totally an open. It's just honored.
Yeah.
It's
And they should,
honored.
right, they should be getting the support that they need, whether that's through their religion or through their family, whatever,
Yes,
for them to be feeling comfortable during their last few days for sure. And I can see how that would be challenging with the food too, because, the family wants to provide them with something that they
yes,
like and they feel comforted with. Sometimes it's comforting seeing a food that you're very familiar with from your culture,
yes,
but at the same time,
yes,
it might not be very safe for the patient. So
yeah,
it's very conflicting. You don't know what to do in that situation. Yeah.
yeah. Or even, some cultures believe that you shouldn't be talking about, the loved one who's dying
Hmm.
in front of them,
Okay.
because if we tell them, if they know, then maybe that they will give up and
Mm-hmm.
they will die sooner,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So that may not be everybody's belief, but if that's their belief, then the conversations then aren't made in front of that person, and the conversations are outside of the room, right? So, like I said, my experience from palliative is that those things have been, there's a lot of respect and value and honor
Mm-hmm.
given to the body and the mind and the soul,
Mm-hmm.
because we're not just one thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sacredness, I believe, of the work
Mm-hmm.
in palliative care, is that it isn't just one thing,
Yeah,
it's the whole person.
exactly. It's quite
And
holistic.
at the end of life, that really kind of just culminates, right?
Mm-hmm.
The,
Right.
the physical state of the emotional place, and then what are the spiritual needs
Mhm.
of that person.
Right.
So
How,
all of it is
mhm.
considered.
That's great. How you can attend to them not only like through their physical ailments, but
Right.
culturally what their family would also like as well. I see.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that that's those are all great points that we discussed today, and I wanted to thank you so much for coming on today. I enjoyed this conversation so much, and all of the insights that you had to provide were just so wonderful to hear about. And thank you so much, Mrs. Iwama.
Oh, well, thank you for this privilege. Okay.